For decades, geneticists assumed that two of the largest Jewish communities on Earth had drifted so far apart that their DNA would tell almost unrelated stories. One group had spent nearly 1,000 years in the cold cities of Central and Eastern Europe. The other had built a civilization under Islamic and later Christian rule in Spain, before being expelled in 1492 and scattering across North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. On the surface, these looked like two separate peoples who simply happened to share a religion, a set of holidays, and a handful of old prayers in a language neither community spoke at home anymore. Then, scientists sequenced their genomes side by side. What the data revealed was strange enough and specific enough that it forced historians to rewrite parts of the story of the Jewish people. This is not a simple tale of one ancient bloodline traveling unbroken through the centuries. It is a story about a population that fractured, scattered, nearly vanished in places, and repeatedly intermarried with the very neighbors who sometimes persecuted it, yet somehow kept a genetic thread running through 2,000 years of exile. To understand why the discovery mattered so much, you first have to understand just how different these two communities had actually become. Picture a Jewish merchant in 16th century Krakow, speaking Yiddish, eating rye bread and pickled herring, praying in a wooden synagogue surrounded by frozen forests. Now picture a Jewish physician in 16th century Salonika, speaking Ladino, trading spices along the Mediterranean, living under Ottoman rule in a city of minarets and bathhouses. These two people would have had almost nothing in common day to day. Different languages, different food, different laws governing their lives. If you had asked either of them whether they were the same people, the answer might have been complicated even for them. And yet both would have told you the same origin story. Both trace their ancestry to the ancient Israelites of the Levant, the region roughly covering modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan. Both maintained a tradition of descent from the same biblical ancestors, exiled first by the Babylonians, then scattered further by the Romans after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. For centuries, this was a matter of faith, impossible to verify. Some scholars went further, proposing that certain Jewish populations were not biological descendants of the ancient Israelites at all, but the product of mass religious conversion by other peoples entirely. One especially controversial version of this idea claimed that Ashkenazi Jews actually descended from the Khazars, a Turkic people whose ruling class, according to some medieval accounts, converted to Judaism in the 8th or 9th century. Keep that theory in mind. It is going to come back, and when it does, the fight over it gets personal. But before science could weigh in, the two communities had already spent 1,000 years growing apart. Sephardic Jews take their name from Sepharad, the Hebrew word for Spain, where their communities produced philosophers, physicians, and court advisors during what is often remembered as a golden age. It was the world that shaped Maimonides, one of the most influential Jewish philosophers in history, who trained as a physician in Cordoba before his family, too, was eventually forced to flee religious persecution. That golden age ended in a single year. In 1492, the Spanish crown ordered Jews to convert or leave. Tens of thousands fled to North Africa, the Balkans, and the Ottoman Empire, carrying their language, Ladino, into entirely new worlds. Ashkenazi Jews moved the opposite direction. Their name comes from a medieval Hebrew term for Germany, and their communities took root in the Rhineland before migrating steadily eastward, eventually concentrating in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. They built Yiddish out of medieval German, Hebrew, and Slavic threads, and they built an entire religious and cultural world shaped by recurring waves of violence that kept pushing the community further east in search of safety. By the modern era, these were, for all practical purposes, two different peoples who happened to share a book. 19th century scholars working without any genetic tools tried to settle the question using skull measurements and folklore, methods now recognized as unreliable and, in some cases, entangled with the racial pseudoscience of the time. The question sat unresolved for over a century. It needed a completely different kind of evidence. It needed DNA. Starting in the late 1990s and accelerating fast after 2000, geneticists gained the ability to read not just a handful of genetic markers, but hundreds of thousands of them scattered across the entire human genome. Suddenly, researchers could compare Jewish populations around the world not through language or legend, but through the molecular record carried inside their cells. Teams in Israel, the United States, and Europe began collecting samples from Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Yemenite Jews, alongside non-Jewish populations across the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa. The goal was almost absurdly ambitious: reconstruct, using biology alone, the migration history of a people scattered across 4 continents for 2,000 years. In 2010, a landmark study led by geneticist Doron Bahar and a large international team examined genome-wide data covering a huge share of the global Jewish population. Around the same time, a separate team, led by Gil Atzmon and Harry Osterer, published closely related findings. Both groups were asking the same blunt question: strip away religion, language, and culture. Look only at the DNA. Do Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews actually share a common ancestral population? Or did 2 unrelated groups simply adopt the same faith independently? The results arrived fast and from several directions at once. The first finding involved what's called autosomal DNA, the DNA you inherit from both of your parents, and that reflects your whole ancestry, not just one narrow line. When researchers compared the autosomal DNA of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, they found something almost nobody expected at that scale. The 2 communities were genetically closer to each other than either was to the non-Jewish neighbors they had lived beside for 1,000 years. A Jewish family from Poland and a Jewish family from Morocco were, on a genetic level, more closely related to one another than either was to their own Polish or Moroccan neighbors next door. That alone would have been remarkable. But the data pushed further. When researchers traced the genetic markers back toward their most likely point of origin, both populations pointed to the same place: the Eastern Mediterranean, the ancient Levant. 2 communities that had spent 1,000 years apart, speaking different languages and living under different laws, still carried a signature pointing back to the same homeland. So here was a real answer to a question historians had argued over for a century. Most Jewish communities worldwide, however culturally distinct they had become, descended substantially from a shared Middle Eastern founding population. But that answer immediately created a new question, and it's the question that makes this story interesting rather than just tidy. If Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews share the same ancestral core, why do they look so different today? Why do some Ashkenazi Jews carry skin and hair coloring typical of Northern Europe, while many Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews resemble their Mediterranean and Middle Eastern neighbors? The DNA had an answer for that too. It's called admixture, the gradual mixing of a population with its neighbors, generation after generation, over centuries. Multiple studies converged on a strikingly consistent number. Over roughly 1,000 years in Europe, Ashkenazi Jews accumulated somewhere around 40 to 50% of their genetic ancestry from European populations, layered on top of their original Middle Eastern base. This wasn't one dramatic event. It was a slow accumulation of intermarriage and conversion, happening quietly across dozens of generations. Several studies even found an unusually strong genetic link to modern Italians, suggesting some of this mixing began early, while Jewish communities were still concentrated around the Mediterranean, before the migration north and east into Poland and Russia. Sephardic Jews show a comparable pattern with a different accent. North African Sephardic communities carry genetic contributions from local Berber and Arab populations, layered onto the same Middle Eastern base, while still remaining closely tied to Ashkenazi Jews genetically. A Middle Eastern population fractured 2,000 years ago, mixed locally at different rates in different places, and somehow never lost the thread connecting it back to itself. Now remember that Khazar theory, the one about a Turkic kingdom converting to Judaism and supposedly becoming the ancestors of Ashkenazi Jews instead of the Levant. In 2013, geneticist Eran El-Haik published research arguing the genetic data actually supported exactly that, a Caucasus origin rather than a Middle Eastern one. It reignited a genuinely fierce fight because, if true, it would sever the ancestral link between Ashkenazi Jews and the ancient Israelites entirely. Behar's team fired back with a more precise study using DNA from populations actually located within the historical Khazar homeland rather than the substitute populations El-Haik had used, which turned out to be from the wrong part of the Caucasus. When they reran the analysis with corrected geography, the Caucasus signal El-Haik had found largely disappeared. Ashkenazi Jews still showed their strongest genetic ties to Sephardic Jews and to Middle Eastern and Southern European populations, not to anyone north of the Caucasus. That doesn't mean a Khazar conversion never happened historically. It just means, according to the best current evidence, it left little to no detectable trace in the ancestry of Ashkenazi Jews alive today. Independent teams since have generally sided with Behar rather than El-Haik, which is why most geneticists now treat the Khazar hypothesis as a minority position. Not every scientist considers the matter fully closed. And in a field this young, that kind of caution is healthy rather than evasive. It's worth understanding why this particular debate got so heated, because the stakes were never purely academic. The Khazar hypothesis has, at various points, been picked up outside of serious scholarship and used to argue that Ashkenazi Jews have no historical claim to the Levant at all. A political argument the genetic data simply does not support. On the other side, some critics of the Khazar hypothesis have accused its proponents of politically motivated reasoning as well. Reputable geneticists on both sides of the scientific question have generally tried to keep the biology separate from the politics. But it's a useful reminder that population genetics doesn't happen in a vacuum. The data speaks for itself, but people are never neutral about what that data might mean. While that fight was playing out on the autosomal side, a second, quieter investigation was happening on the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son. It's ideal for tracing one very specific Jewish tradition, the Cohanim, the hereditary priestly line that tradition says descends directly from Aaron, brother of Moses. When researchers examined the Y chromosomes of men identifying as Cohanim in communities as far apart as Yemen, Eastern Europe, and North Africa, they found something that gave even skeptical scientists pause. A striking share of these men, across populations with no contact for over 1,000 years, shared a specific set of Y chromosome markers pointing to one common paternal ancestor dated to the Middle East more than 2,000 years ago. A tradition preserved for millennia purely through religious practice and family memory, with no paperwork behind it at all, turned out to leave a real, measurable signature in the genome. Researchers ended up naming this shared genetic signature the Cohen modal haplotype. And when the first results came back in the late 1990s, even the scientists running the study were reportedly cautious about how strong the pattern looked. A religious title passed down purely by word of mouth for over 2,000 years, with every opportunity for the chain to break, and the DNA lined up anyway. The Levites tell a messier story, and a more revealing one. Levites are the other hereditary caste in Jewish tradition, historically assisting the priesthood. When researchers ran the same analysis on Ashkenazi Levites, they didn't find the tight Near Eastern signature seen in the Cohanim. Instead, a large share carried a distinctly European Y chromosome lineage. The likely explanation? At some point in Ashkenazi history, a European male line was absorbed into the Levite caste, and its descendants kept the title and the religious role for generations, despite carrying non-Levantine paternal ancestry. Genetics, in this one case, complicated the tradition instead of confirming it. It's a reminder that this is not one clean story. It's several overlapping stories, moving at different speeds through different family lines.
Then there's the maternal side, traced through mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child. And this is where things get genuinely strange. Several studies found that a large share of Ashkenazi maternal lineages, in some estimates around 40% or more, trace back to just a small handful of founding women. Not a broad wave of Middle Eastern mothers migrating into Europe, but a narrow founding group whose exact origin, Near Eastern or local European, remains debated. One influential explanation is that early Ashkenazi communities formed when a relatively small number of Jewish men settled in Europe and partnered with local women, who then joined the community and passed on their maternal DNA, while Jewish identity itself continued to pass down through religious law and communal life rather than biology alone. Scientists don't fully agree on the details yet. A 2013 study led by researcher Marta Costa went further still, arguing that most of the major Ashkenazi maternal lineages actually trace back to prehistoric Europe rather than the Near East at all, which would mean the community's female ancestry is overwhelmingly local, not imported. That conclusion remains contested, with other researchers pointing out limitations in how ancient the comparison data really was. What almost everyone agrees on, regardless of which side of that argument they land on, is the underlying pattern beneath it. A population that at some point shrank down to a strikingly small number of founders. That bottleneck turned out to be one of the most consequential discoveries in the entire field. And the way researchers found it is worth understanding because the logic behind it is almost elegant in its simplicity. Every time two people have a child, that child inherits long, intact stretches of DNA from each parent, stretches that get chopped up a little more with each new generation. If two people alive today happen to share an unusually long, identical stretch of DNA, it means they share a fairly recent common ancestor, because there hasn't been enough time for that stretch to get broken apart by more generations of mixing. Geneticists scanned thousands of Ashkenazi genomes looking for exactly this kind of shared DNA. And what they found was startling. Almost everyone in the sample was connected to almost everyone else through these long shared segments, far more than you'd expect in a large open population. The only way to produce that pattern is if the entire group descended from a genuinely small number of founders relatively recently. Running the numbers, researchers calculated that the entire Ashkenazi Jewish population descends from a founding group of only a few hundred people, roughly 600 to 800 years ago. Because the community then stayed largely closed for centuries, marrying within itself rather than outside it, that tiny founding population grew into a global community of millions. Every one of them still carrying a trace of that same narrow starting point. This single discovery solved a medical mystery doctors had puzzled over for decades. It explains why conditions like Tay-Sachs disease, certain forms of Gaucher disease, and specific hereditary breast and ovarian cancer mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes show up far more often in Ashkenazi Jews than in the general population. This has nothing to do with any inherent vulnerability. It's simple math. A handful of gene variants happen to exist by chance in that small founding population centuries ago. And because the group stayed relatively closed while it grew, those variants became proportionally far more common than they would be in a larger, more mixed population. A demographic accident from 6 centuries ago, still shaping the health of millions of people who have never heard the word genomics. Sephardic communities carry their own, generally milder versions of this same pattern, shaped by their own history, moving through Iberia, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire after 1492. Different starting populations, different centuries, the same underlying genetic fingerprint of isolation and endogamy. But the most unexpected finding connected to the Sephardic expulsion wasn't found in Jewish communities at all. It was found in Spain and Portugal themselves. When researchers examined the Y chromosomes of men in the general Iberian population, centuries after the expulsion and forced conversions of 1492, they found that a substantial share, in one widely cited estimate, around 1 in 5 men across the region, carried Y chromosome markers strongly associated with Sephardic Jewish ancestry. In other words, hundreds of thousands of Spaniards and Portuguese today, many with no idea of any Jewish family history at all, are walking around with a direct genetic link to the very community their ancestors were once forced to convert or expel. History tried to erase that population from Iberia. The DNA never got the message.
There's another layer to this that later, higher resolution studies uncovered, and it complicates the neat two-way Ashkenazi Sephardic story just enough to make it more honest. When researchers zoomed in further, they found that Jewish populations worldwide don't split cleanly into just 2 groups. They tend to cluster into roughly 4. Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic and North African Jews, Mizrahi Jews from Iraq, Iran, and the broader Middle East, and Yemenite Jews, each showing its own distinct genetic fingerprint layered on top of the shared Levantine core. Even within the North African cluster, Tunisian and Libyan Jewish communities turned out to be genetically distinct enough from other Sephardic groups to form their own separate branch, a level of detail that simply wasn't visible until sample sizes and marker counts grew large enough to resolve it. The closer scientists looked, the more the Jewish diaspora looked less like a single tree with 2 branches and more like a tree with an entire canopy, each branch shaped by its own centuries of local history. The most emotionally complicated twist in this whole field involves populations even further from Europe. Yemenite Jews show strong genetic continuity with the Middle East, layered with distinct traits from centuries of isolation on the Arabian Peninsula. Ethiopian Jews, often called Beta Israel, tell a very different story. Genetic studies generally find them closer to their East African neighbors than to other Jewish communities worldwide, suggesting a history of conversion or a far more ancient and separate divergence, rather than a shared recent departure from the Levant. This finding has been genuinely sensitive because it touches questions of belonging that DNA alone was never built to answer. Most geneticists working in this space are careful to say the same thing here. Genetic ancestry and religious or cultural identity are related, but they are not the same question. And DNA should never be the sole judge of who belongs to a community defined for thousands of years by faith and lived experience, not lab results. Not everyone in the scientific and scholarly world is comfortable with this entire line of research, and that pushback deserves a fair hearing too. Some historians and social scientists have warned that framing Jewish identity in genetic terms, even carefully, and even when the science itself is sound, risks reviving older and more dangerous ideas about ethnicity as something rooted in blood rather than history, culture, and choice. Judaism has never been a closed biological category. People have converted into Jewish communities throughout history, in every era and on every continent. And their descendants are every bit as Jewish as anyone whose ancestry traces back an unbroken genetic line to the Levant. The geneticists behind these major studies have generally agreed with that criticism rather than dismissed it, going out of their way to say that a shared genetic signature describes a population's demographic history, not who does or doesn't count as Jewish today. DNA can describe where a group has been. It was never equipped to say who belongs. So what does all of this actually add up to? It means the story Jewish communities told about themselves for 2,000 years, of one people scattered by empire, surviving through faith and memory while adapting to wildly different host cultures, turns out to be substantially backed by the evidence written into human DNA. Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews remain each other's closest genetic relatives outside their own communities, and both trace a real share of their ancestry back to the Eastern Mediterranean. The Cohanim tradition, kept alive for millennia with no paperwork at all, shows up in the Y chromosome record. But it isn't a story of unbroken purity either. It's a story of repeated mixing, of European ancestry woven into Ashkenazi communities, and North African ancestry woven into Sephardic ones. Of one caste's paternal line apparently being quietly replaced at some point in history, and of a bottleneck so severe it still shapes the health of millions of descendants today. There's a layer of irony in all of this that historians of modern Israel in particular have pointed out. For much of the 20th century, Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish communities, reunited in large numbers for the first time in centuries following waves of immigration into Israel, did not simply fall into each other's arms as long-lost relatives. Real social and economic hierarchies developed between the groups, with Ashkenazi communities often holding disproportionate institutional power, and Sephardic and Mizrahi immigrants facing discrimination and marginalization that shaped Israeli politics and society for decades. None of that tension was really about genetics. It was about culture, class, and the accident of which community happened to arrive with which resources and connections. The genetic findings didn't resolve those tensions, and they were never going to. But they did add an unexpected footnote to the whole debate. The two groups drawing social lines between each other were, on a molecular level, each other's closest relatives on Earth.
And this isn't just an academic footnote. Long before genome-wide sequencing existed, Ashkenazi communities had already noticed that Tay-Sachs disease was devastating families at rates no one could fully explain. And by the 1980s, community-driven carrier screening programs were already being built specifically around this population, well before scientists understood the genetic bottleneck sitting behind it. Once the full genomic picture came into focus, those screening efforts only became more precise, expanding to cover the wider panel of conditions now known to cluster in Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, and helping prospective parents make informed decisions before a child is ever born. Historians, meanwhile, have had to fold hard genetic timelines into narratives once built almost entirely from documents and tombstones. And ordinary people, taking consumer DNA tests by the millions, keep discovering these exact patterns in their own results, sometimes connecting a family story passed down for generations to an actual measurable signature in their own cells for the very first time. There's something quietly profound sitting underneath all of it. For 2,000 years, a population was pushed out of its homeland, scattered across continents, forced through cycles of persecution and expulsion, and it never fully dissolved into the populations around it. A merchant in Krakow and a physician in Salonika, separated by a continent, a language, and centuries of divergent history, never met, never corresponded, and never knew the other existed. And yet, buried in cells they never saw and couldn't have understood, they were still carrying pieces of the same distant story. Culture and communal memory did what borders and centuries could not. They kept a thread of identity alive. And it turns out that thread was never just cultural. It was written into the DNA the whole time, running quietly through nearly 2,000 years of exile, long before anyone alive knew what a chromosome was. None of this needed to be true. 1,000 years is long enough to erase almost anything. Languages die, records burn, communities scatter and simply stop remembering where they came from. That the genetic evidence lined up with the oral tradition at all across a diaspora this vast and this violently disrupted is not something science guaranteed in advance. It is something the data happened to confirm. And that is precisely what makes it worth pausing on. What makes this discovery so extraordinary isn't just what it reveals about the deep past of one particular people. It's what it suggests about identity itself, about how a group of human beings scattered across the earth for 2 millennia, speaking different languages and living under different flags, can still carry within their cells the quiet, persistent signature of exactly where they began.